I have recently visited Montpelier, the plantation home of James Madison in Virginia. James Madison was born in Port Conway, Virginia on March 16, 1751. His parents were James Madison Sr. and Eleanor Conway Madison. When Madison was a boy, he was often ill. While he was sick, he began to read and study many books. Due to his parents' wealth, young James Madison was afforded tutors. As a shy and quiet young man, learning came easily to James. Madison graduated from the College of New Jersey, later known as Princeton. It took Madison only 2 years to complete his college education. Years later, in 1801, when Madison's father died, James inherited several thousand acres and a large number of slaves. Having already married the widow Dolly Payne Todd in 1794, they now have the responsibility for the Montpelier estate. Although they had no children of their own, Dolly had a son, John Payne, from her previous marriage. Madison is considered to have been the intellectual powerhouse of our founding fathers. His writing skills and his commanding understanding of various types of government made him a natural choice to write the Constitution of the United States, a document that would design to govern our country for years to come. Ironically, while Madison was writing the Constitution, which addressed the liberty of individual, he owned slaves. James struggled with the idea of slaves as property. However, the availability of all the slave labor gave Madison the time to study other forms of government, which led to the writing of our Constitution. Indeed, one great irony was that most of our founding fathers owned slaves, while fighting for individual rights and freedom. In addition to writing the Constitution, James Madison became the 4th President of the United States and served 2 terms from 1809 to 1817. In contrast to the successful intellectual plantation owner, there was another intelligent individual nearby. His name was Paul Jennings. Paul was born into slavery in 1799 at Montpelier. His mother was an enslaved woman, and his father, Benjamin Jennings, was a white merchant who was never a part of Paul's life. Later, in 1817, as a member of the household servants, Paul Jennings lived in the Montpelier South Yard with the slaves who served the Madison family. The Montpelier Foundation has recreated slave quarters in the South Yard. During my recent visit, I was able to experience the recreation of a cabin that resembles Jennings' humble beginnings. It quickly became apparent that the slaves had limited access to things we take for granted. Their cabins were too small and had no comforts that were afforded the residents in the Montpelier mansion. Inside the cabin contains displays that features Jennings' descendants and their personal stories and struggles. In 1809, when James Madison began serving his first term as president, Jennings was only 10 years old. However, he moved into the White House so he could serve the Madisons. Paul's presence in the Madison household with children of Madison's relatives gave him the opportunity to learn, read, and write. While serving the Madisons, he learned to prepare the table, placing wine in coolers for formal dinners, and many of the skills of the modern-day butler. Jennings later would become Madison's manservant, and Paul's presence in the dining room, often filled with government leaders and foreign dignitaries, allowed him to overhear many intellectual conversations. Paul Jennings was becoming a learned man while excelling in his role as a Madison's manservant. Also, during my visit to Montpelier, I was able to visit a new display in the basement cellar of the mansion called The Mere Distinction of Color. This display gives its title by a quote by Madison. "We have seen the mere distinction of color, made in the most enlightened period of time, a ground of the most oppressive dominion ever exercised by man over man." James Madison, June 6, 1787. To learn more about the process of uncovering the story of the enslaved community at Madison's estate, I had the opportunity to interview Dr. Matt Reeves, Director of Archaeology at Montpelier. Today I'm talking with Dr. Matt Reeves, the archaeologist at James Madison Montpelier. Recently you have been exploring the lives of the slaves at Montpelier. Why did you start this project?
Well, we started the project. First, we were finding lots of archaeological evidence for slave quarters around the main house at Montpelier. And in 2008, we had enough evidence, or we outlined where these buildings were so visitors could understand where they were located. And we had just completed the restoration, and we had a group of descendants of Madison slaves who came out to visit. We did a reunion, and when they saw, how their ancestors' homes were represented, basically with, we had cut the grass down to show where the buildings were. We hadn't reconstructed them at all, and had some what appeared to be railroad ties out there. They asked, you just did this $27 million restoration for the main house, for the Madisons, and our ancestors' homes are shown with what appears to be dead grass and railroad ties. And they're like, what's up with that? And so I realized, holy cow, we need to make more of an effort to really understand these buildings and represent them on the landscape than just doing kind of a casual representation. So we applied for NEH grant, National Endowment for the Humanities, and spent about 3 years excavating and researching the homes of the enslaved individuals that are around the main house and further out at the field quarter. And by 2011, we've been able to represent their homes with these timber frame outlines, and then that initiated a gift from David Rubenstein in 2014 to actually reconstruct them completely. So we've got these homes reconstructed and really allow visitors to ask the kind of questions that really show, more detail about slaves' lives and get them to understand that these enslaved individuals are more than just property. They had their own individual lives and families and the sacrifices they made in terms of creating Montpelier in our country as well.
Okay. What have you learned about Paul Jennings during your research?
Well, what we've learned about Paul Jennings, a lot of it comes from the documentary records. We did a lot of oral histories with families. They had quite a few documents that they had saved through the years about the Paul Jennings. And then also just did a lot of documentary research. We have not found any, we know he would have lived in the South Yard. And we're going to be representing one of those buildings as his home. We have it represented as his home. And really, it's been working with the descendants with Paul Jennings that we've learned the most about him and really been able to really bring him back to life in terms of, having the voices of his descendants talk about what it means to them to have their great-great-grandfather represented here at Montpelier. So it's been a mix between the archaeology, oral history, and then the documentary record.
To summarize the conflict and compromise for James Madison is that he was painfully aware of the injustice in treating slaves as property. His compromise, such as it was the decision to free his slaves upon his death. Sadly, his wife, Dolly, did not honor his request. Regarding Paul Jennings' dilemma of conflict and compromise, perhaps it's best stated by Elizabeth Dowling Taylor in her book, A Slave in the White House. As for Jennings, his exposure to the visual and auditory feast at Montpelier was a daily education. The light, the knowledge, was shared with him, even inadvertently. Yes, he sighed for freedom, but he did not choose life as a fugitive. Instead, for the time being, Jennings fashioned a life of meaning while still enslaved. He learned to balance his divided loyalties carefully. He knew how to succeed within the system in which he was trapped.